The rain pattered against the windows of Richard Harrington's sleek Audi as he sat trapped in Boston's notorious downtown traffic. Normally, the rhythmic sound would have soothed him, but today it only intensified his restlessness. His day had been a blur of meetings, handshakes, and corporate negotiations, standard fare for the CEO of Harrington Enterprises. At 58, Richard had everything a man could want: wealth, power, respect. Yet the emptiness that had taken residence in his chest years ago remained stubbornly present. "Mr. Harrington, are you still there?" His executive assistant's voice crackled through the car's Bluetooth system. Richard cleared his throat. "Yes, Diane. Just send the quarterly reports to my email. I'll review them tonight. And the Thompson merger, we'll discuss it tomorrow." He cut her off, ending the call with a tap to the console. His driver, Marcus, glanced at him through the rearview mirror but said nothing. After 15 years working for Richard, he knew when his boss needed silence. The traffic light ahead turned red, bringing the car to a complete stop. Richard loosened his tie and gazed out at Boylston Street, watching pedestrians hurry by with umbrellas and raincoats, their faces set in determined expressions. His mind drifted to the conversation he'd had with his therapist earlier that week. "You've built an empire, Richard," Dr. Kent had said. "But what's it all for if there's no one to share it with?" The question had angered him then. Now, it just made him tired. A soft knock on the window jarred him from his thoughts. Richard turned to see a young boy, no more than 10 or 11, standing in the pouring rain. The child wore a threadbare jacket 2 sizes too big, jeans with patches at the knees, and no shoes. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead, water streaming down his face. But it was his eyes that caught Richard's attention, deep brown, serious, and carrying a weight that children shouldn't have to bear. The boy held up something in his small hand, a toy of some sort, crudely made but carefully crafted. He knocked again, his expression neither pleading nor demanding, simply determined. "Sir?" Marcus asked, his hand hovering over the lock controls. Richard hesitated. He normally ignored street vendors and beggars, a habit born from years of city living and the advice of security consultants. But something about this boy struck a chord within him. "It's fine, Marcus. I'll handle this." Richard pressed the button to lower his window. The sound of falling rain immediately filled the car. "Uncle, please buy my toy," the boy said, his voice steady despite his shivering frame. "I need money for my grandpa's medicine. He's very sick." The accent was subtle but unmistakable, Hispanic, possibly Mexican or Salvadoran. Richard had heard similar accents in the kitchens of upscale restaurants and on construction sites around the city. "What's your name, kid?" Richard asked. "Daniel, sir." "And what's that you're selling?" Daniel held up the small object more clearly now. It was a wooden truck, hand-carved and painted in faded red and blue. "I made it myself. $5, but..." He hesitated. "I can take 3 if that's all you have." Richard felt something stir within him, not just pity, but a strange sense of déjà vu. The toy truck looked oddly familiar, though he couldn't place why. "Hold on a minute," he told the boy. Then, to his driver, "Marcus, we're stopping here for a bit." Marcus nodded and pulled the car to the curb, ignoring the honks from vehicles behind them. Richard stepped out into the rain, his Italian leather shoes immediately soaked. Up close, Daniel looked even smaller, his thin shoulders hunched against the cold. The businessman's instinct was to hand the boy a 20 and send him on his way, a generous moment that would satisfy his conscience without disrupting his schedule. Instead, he found himself asking, "May I see it?" Daniel hesitated, clutching the truck protectively. His eyes darted to Richard's expensive suit, then to the luxury car behind him, clearly assessing whether this man could be trusted. "I won't take it," Richard assured him. "I just want a closer look." Slowly, "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "I told you I made it." "No," Richard insisted, turning the truck to show the initials. "These letters. LG. Do you know what they mean?" The boy's eyes widened slightly. "A tell. My grandpa taught me to carve. He puts those letters on everything he makes." "Your grandfather," Richard repeated, feeling as though the ground beneath him had turned to quicksand. "What's his name?" Daniel took a small step back. "Luis, sir. Luis Garcia." The name hit Richard like a physical blow. Luis Garcia. LG. The Spanish version of Louis Garrett. "And your mother?" he asked, though he already knew, feared, the answer. "She died when I was a baby," Daniel replied, his voice smaller now. "Grandpa has a picture. Her name was Sofia. Sofia Mendez, his son's wife. The woman Richard had forbidden his son to marry 15 years ago." Richard stared at the boy, struggling to maintain his composure as his mind raced. The rain continued to fall around them, but he barely noticed it now. Marcus had stepped out of the car and was holding an umbrella over them, concern evident on his face. "Sir, you're getting soaked. Should we get back in the car?" "Marcus," Richard said, his voice distant. "Turn off the meter. I'm taking a personal day." The driver hesitated, then nodded and returned to the vehicle. Richard knelt down to Daniel's level, ignoring the water seeping through his $3,000 suit pants. "Daniel, are you hungry?" The boy's eyes darted away, pride battling with necessity. "I need to sell more toys. Grandpa needs medicine." "I'll buy all your toys," Richard said firmly, "and I'll help with the medicine. But first, let's get something to eat." Daniel looked suspicious. Why would you do that? It was a fair question, one that reflected a child's understanding of a world where nothing came for free. Richard couldn't possibly explain the storm of emotions coursing through him, so he settled for a partial truth. "Because I used to make toys like this with my son. A long time ago, 2 blocks away, they found a small diner called Rosie's. It was the kind of place Richard would never have entered under normal circumstances. Worn vinyl booths, slightly sticky menus, and the pervasive smell of fried food. But it was warm and dry, and the waitress didn't bat an eye at Richard's expensive, rain-soaked clothing or at Daniel's shoeless feet. "Get whatever you want," Richard told the boy as they slid into a booth. Daniel ordered a cheeseburger, fries, and a chocolate milkshake without hesitation. Richard asked for coffee, black. He kept the wooden truck on the table between them, unable to look away from it. "How old are you, Daniel?" 11 next month, the boy replied, eyes fixed on the kitchen door as if willing his food to appear faster. The timeline matched. Louis and Sophia had been married for nearly a year when Richard received news of the fire. If Daniel was born shortly before that. "And your grandfather, Luis, he takes care of you?" Daniel nodded, finally looking at Richard. "We live together. He was a carpenter, but now he can't work. His lungs are bad, and his hands shake." The waitress arrived with their order, placing the heaping plate in front of Daniel. The boy waited until she left before attacking the food with the focused intensity of someone who hadn't Louis's access to his trust fund, expecting his son to come crawling back once reality set in. Instead, Louis disappeared. For months, there was no contact. Then came the fire. A tenement building in Dorchester, multiple casualties. The police contacted Richard as next of kin. 2 bodies, burned beyond recognition, identified through dental records as Louis and Sophia Harrington. Richard had paid for the funeral. Closed casket, sparsely attended. He'd stood alone at the cemetery, wondering how things had gone so wrong. In the years that followed, he had buried himself in work, using success as a balm for grief and guilt. "Why does your grandfather put LG on the toys?" Richard asked, his voice strangely calm despite the turmoil inside him. Daniel had finished his burger and was now working methodically through the fries, making them last. He says it's to remember someone important, someone he lost. Richard's hand tightened around his coffee mug. Daniel, does your grandfather know you're out selling these toys? The boy nodded. It was his idea. He taught me how to make them, but his hands can't do it anymore. We sell them to buy food and his medicine. And where do you live? Daniel hesitated, wariness returning to his eyes. An old building on Creighton Street. It used to be a factory. Lots of people live there now. Richard knew the area, a string of abandoned industrial buildings being eyed by developers, including his own company. The irony wasn't lost on him. Daniel, I'd like to meet your grandfather. The boy's face hardened. Why? Are you from the city? We're not doing anything wrong. That building has been empty for years. I'm not from the city, Richard assured him. I just want to talk to him. About the toy. He picked up the wooden truck, turning it over in his hands. The craftsmanship was unmistakable now, the same techniques he had taught Louis during those Sunday afternoons in the garage workshop. Daniel finished his milkshake, considering. He doesn't like visitors. He gets nervous around strangers. I understand, but this is important. I'll pay for his medicine, whatever he needs. The suspicion in Daniel's eyes deepened. What do you want from us? The question hit Richard like a physical blow. What did he want? To confirm if Luis Garcia was actually his son? To ease his conscience? To make amends for 15 years of absence? He wasn't sure himself. I just want to help, he said finally. Daniel studied him with an intensity that seemed far beyond his years. Finally, he nodded. Okay, but if Grandpa doesn't want to talk to you, you have to leave. That's fair. They left the diner, Richard leaving a $100 bill for a $30 meal. He instructed Marcus to drive them to Creighton Street, ignoring the concerned glance his driver gave him through the rearview mirror. As the car pulled away from the curb, Richard kept the wooden truck in his hands, tracing the initials with his thumb. For the first time in many years, he allowed himself to remember the last toy he and Louis had made together, a wooden truck painted red and blue, with LG carved on the bottom. It couldn't be the same truck. That would be impossible. And yet, the weight of it in his hands felt like a message from the past, a ghost reaching across time to tap him on the shoulder. My son is alive, he whispered to himself, too quietly for anyone else to hear. The Audi felt obscenely out of place as it rolled not far from the building's entrance. A group of men huddled around a trash can fire, watching them with undisguised interest. Don't look at them, Daniel said quietly, taking Richard's hand and pulling him toward a side entrance. Just walk normal. The gesture, this child trying to protect him, made Richard's chest tighten. They entered through a rusted metal door that Daniel had to tug hard to open. Inside, the building was a maze of half-collapsed walls, exposed wiring, and makeshift barriers creating semblances of privacy. People lived in these spaces. Richard could see mattresses, clothing hung on lines, even a few portable camping stoves. Most residents looked away as they passed, but some stared openly. Richard, with his tailored suit and polished shoes, might as well have been an alien spacecraft landing in their midst. Daniel navigated the labyrinth with practiced ease, leading Richard to a back corner of the building's second floor. Their home was a space about 15 feet square, sectioned off with hanging tarps and pallets. It contained 2 thin mattresses on the floor, a few milk crates serving as storage and furniture, and a camp lantern that provided the only light. On one of the mattresses lay a man, his face turned toward the cracked window that allowed a shaft of gray daylight to enter the space. He was thin, painfully so, with a blanket pulled up to his chest despite the room's stuffiness. One side of his face was mottled with burn scars that disappeared beneath the collar of his shirt. "Grandpa," Daniel called softly. "I'm back. I brought someone." The man turned slowly, his eyes taking a moment to focus. When they did, they narrowed with immediate suspicion at the sight of Richard. "Who is this?" His voice was raspy, each word seeming to cost him effort. The accent was thicker than Daniel's, but still mild, the result of years in the United States. "He bought my truck, Grandpa. He wants to help with your medicine." Luis Garcia struggled to sit up, pride overriding weakness. "We don't need charity." Richard stood frozen at the edge of their living space, unable to look away from the man's face. Despite the scarring, despite 15 years of hardship etched into every line, he could see his son. The same strong jawline, the same slight cleft in the chin. But most telling of all were the eyes, Harrington eyes, cool gray like a winter sea. "Louis," Richard whispered, the name escaping before he could stop it. The effect was immediate. Luis stiffened, his hand instinctively reaching for Daniel and pulling the boy closer to him. "My name is Luis Garcia," he said firmly. "You have the wrong person." Richard stepped forward, his legs unsteady. "Your mother's maiden name." "Garcia." He shook his head, memories clicking into place. "You took her name after the fire. You wanted everyone to think you were dead." Daniel looked between them, confusion evident on his young face. "Grandpa," Luis's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The silence in the room became oppressive, broken only by the distant sounds of the building's other occupants and Luis's labored breathing. "Daniel," Luis finally said, "go see if Mrs. Ramirez needs help with her groceries. But now, please." The boy hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave, but eventually nodded and slipped out past the tar. Was grim. "It was the only way I could think to disappear completely, to make sure you wouldn't come looking." The brutality of the statement hit Richard like a physical blow. "But why?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Luis laughed, a harsh sound that dissolved into coughing. When the fit passed, he fixed Richard with a stare that contained 15 years of anger and pain. "Why would I want to escape the great Richard Harrington? The man who told me my wife was a gold digger? Who cut me off without a cent when I married her anyway? Who made it clear that I would never be good enough unless I followed the exact path he laid out for me?" He shook his head. "The better question is, why wouldn't I?" Richard had no answer. The justifications he'd built up over the years, that he was protecting his son, guiding him, preparing him for the real world, seemed hollow now in the face of what that protection had wrought. "And Sophia?" he asked quietly. "What happened to her?" Luis's expression softened slightly, grief momentarily overtaking anger. "Childbirth complications. The hospital was understaffed. She hemorrhaged." His voice broke. "She died holding Daniel." Richard closed his eyes, absorbing this fresh wave of pain. Sophia had died because they couldn't afford proper medical care, care that Richard's money could easily have provided. "I'm sorry," he said, knowing how inadequate the words were. "Your apology means nothing to me," Luis replied. "Nothing you can say will bring her back. And after she died, why stay hidden? Why live like this?" Richard gestured to their surroundings. "Pride, at first," Luis admitted. "I refused to crawl back to you. Then practical reasons. I had a record by then, for check fraud, identity theft. The things I had to do to survive with a newborn." He met Richard's gaze evenly. "And then, as Daniel grew, I realized I didn't want him anywhere near your world. I didn't want him to have anything to do with the Harrington name or what it stands for." Richard flinched. Richard sat in his car that evening, parked across the street from the abandoned Eastman Textiles building. Rain continued to fall, drumming on the roof of the Audi, creating a hypnotic rhythm that matched his tumultuous thoughts. Marcus had been dismissed hours ago, sent home with instructions to say nothing about the day's events. Now Richard was alone, watching shadows move behind the building's broken windows. He hadn't returned to his Beacon Hill penthouse. Couldn't face those empty, perfect rooms. Not after seeing where his son and grandson lived. The conversation with Luis, he still couldn't think of him as Louis, had ended in a stalemate. Richard had offered money, medical care, a place to stay. Luis had refused it all. "We've managed this long without your help," he'd said, his voice strained but resolute. "We don't need it now." Only Daniel's return had prevented the conversation from devolving further. The boy had sensed the tension, his eyes darting between the two men with obvious concern. Richard had left soon after, promising Daniel he would return the next day. Luis hadn't contradicted him, which Richard took as a small victory. Now, staring at the building through the rain-streaked windshield, Richard tried to process everything. His son was alive. He had a grandson. They were living in squalor while he owned 3 homes and a private jet. His phone buzzed. Buildings nearby, part of a redevelopment initiative. The Eastman building was scheduled for demolition in 3 months. The current residents, all squatters in the eyes of the law, would be evicted with minimal notice. His own company was about to make his son and grandson homeless. Richard closed the laptop, suddenly sick to his stomach. He leaned back against the headrest, closing his eyes. The memory of Daniel's small, determined face as he knocked on the car window came back to him. Then another memory, Louis at the same age, showing Richard a drawing he'd made, looking for approval. "What do you think, Dad?" "It's nice, son. But wouldn't your time be better spent on your math homework?" Richard had always been pushing, always planning for his son's future. The right schools, the right connections, the right career path. He'd convinced himself it was love, wanting the best for his child. But sitting here now, he could see it for what it was, control. Fear that his son might make different choices, might not follow the script Richard had written for him. And what had that control cost them both? A movement caught his eye. Daniel was exiting the building, a small plastic container in his hands. He walked to a nearby hydrant where rainwater had pooled and began filling the container. Even from a distance, Richard could see the care the boy took, making sure not to spill a drop. This was how they collected water. From puddles. In America. In Boston. Richard made a decision then. He wouldn't force his way back into their lives. Wouldn't use his money as leverage. But he would not walk away again either. This time, he would stay, however long it took. He pulled out his phone and dialed his lawyer. "Frank, it's Richard. I need you to put a hold on all development plans for the Eastman Textiles property on Creighton Street." "Yes, I know what time it is." "No, it can't wait until morning." Dawn found Richard still in his car, uncomfortable but resolute. He'd dozed off sometime after 3 a.m., only to be awakened by the sounds of the neighborhood coming to life. People emerged from the building, some heading to jobs, others just wandering the streets or sorting through nearby dumpsters. Daniel appeared around 7:30, this time with an elderly woman who walked with a pronounced limp. The boy held her arm, guiding her carefully down the crumbling steps. The woman carried a small cloth bag, likely containing her possessions or perhaps items to sell. At the bottom of the steps, she patted Daniel's cheek affectionately before shuffling off alone. The gesture of kindness, this boy with so little still finding ways to care for others, tightened something in Richard's chest. He got out of the car, his body stiff from the night spent in the driver's seat, and walked across the street. Daniel spotted him immediately, his expression a mix of surprise and something like relief. "You came back," he said. "I said I would." Daniel nodded seriously. "Grandpa's having a bad day. He couldn't sleep because of the coughing." "I'd like to help," Richard said. Not just with money, but with a doctor. Someone who could come here, if your grandfather won't go to a hospital. Daniel considered this, chewing his lower lip thoughtfully. He's proud, but he's really sick. Pride won't help him get better, Richard said gently. Sometimes we need to accept help, even when it's hard. The boy looked up at him, studying his face with that unsettling intensity. You and Grandpa argued yesterday. About before. Richard felt a lump form in his throat. Yes, every Sunday afternoon, in our garage. He was very good at it. A small smile touched Daniel's lips. He taught me everything. Said it was important to know how to make things with your hands. Richard watched as the boy disappeared back into the building, carrying this new connection between them like a fragile gift. It took 3 days for Louise to agree to see a doctor. 3 days during which Richard returned to the Eastman building each morning, sometimes bringing food that Daniel would accept but Louise wouldn't touch. 3 days of sitting in his car at night, unable to return to his normal life, while knowing his son and grandson lived in such conditions. On the 4th day, Louise's condition deteriorated significantly. Richard arrived to find Daniel outside, panicked and tearful. He can't breathe right, the boy said, grabbing Richard's hand and pulling him toward the building. He won't wake up all the way. Inside the makeshift apartment, Louise lay on his mattress, his breathing shallow and labored. His skin had a gray cast to it, and when Richard pressed a hand to his forehead, he felt the heat of a high fever. Call an ambulance, Richard instructed Daniel, already. Pulling out his own phone. No, Louise rasped, his eyes fluttering open. No hospitals. This isn't negotiable, Richard said firmly. You need medical attention now. Louise struggled to sit up, but the effort sent him into a coughing fit that left him even weaker than before. Richard turned away, speaking quickly into his phone, giving the location and a brief description of Louise's symptoms. No insurance, Louise managed between gasping breaths. I'm covering everything, Richard replied. Just focus on breathing. The EMTs arrived remarkably quickly, Richard's name carrying weight even in this neglected corner of the city. They efficiently assessed Louise, administered oxygen, and prepared him for transport. Where are you taking him? Daniel asked, hovering anxiously as they transferred his grandfather to a stretcher. Massachusetts General, one of the paramedics replied. Richard nodded approvingly. It was the best hospital in Boston, where he sat on the board of directors. He placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. We'll follow them there, he promised. The boy looked up at him, tears streaking his dirty face. What if he doesn't get better? The raw fear in those words struck Richard to his core. This child had already lost his mother. The prospect of losing his only remaining parent was terrifying. He will, Richard said with more confidence than he felt. I'll make sure of it. In the car, Daniel sat silently in the back seat, his small frame tense with worry. Richard made a series of calls, to the hospital's chief administrator, to his personal physician, to his assistant who was instructed to cancel all his appointments for the foreseeable future. Mr. Harrington, Marcus said quietly from the driver's seat. Should I arrange for a hotel room for the boy while his grandfather is in the hospital? Before Richard could answer, Daniel spoke up. I'm staying with Grandpa. Richard turned to look at him. Hospitals have rules about visitors, Daniel, especially for intensive care. Then I'll sit in the waiting room, the boy insisted. I'm not going anywhere else. Richard recognized the stubborn set of the child's jaw. It was the same expression Louis had worn countless times during their argument. medication, and a clean living environment. Without those things, he'll likely relapse. Richard nodded, absorbing this information. He'll have everything he needs. Dr. Patel glanced through the window of the hospital room, where Daniel sat beside the bed, watching his grandfather's every breath with anxious intensity. "The boy should be in school," she said quietly. "Has anyone contacted social services?" "That won't be necessary," Richard replied, his tone making it clear the subject was closed. "He's my grandson." The doctor raised an eyebrow but didn't press the issue. Richard spent that night in a chair beside Luis's bed, sending Daniel to sleep on the small couch by the window. Neither of them spoke much. Daniel drifted off eventually, exhaustion overcoming worry. Luis remained sedated, his breathing now assisted by supplemental oxygen. In the quiet darkness of the hospital room, Richard studied his son's face. The burn scars were extensive on the right side, pulling at the corner of his mouth and distorting the cheekbone beneath. His hair had thinned significantly and gone prematurely gray, but Richard could still see traces of the handsome, vibrant young man Luis had been. "I failed you," he whispered to his unconscious son. "In every way that matters." The next few days established a routine. Richard hired a private nurse to supplement the hospital staff. He arranged for clean clothes to be brought for both Luis and Daniel. He authorized whatever treatments the doctors recommended, regardless of cost. Daniel remained glued to his grandfather's side, leaving only when forced to by the nurses who insisted he shower and eat proper meals. Richard used these moments to try connecting with the boy, learning about his life. "Do you go to school?" he asked as they shared a meal in the hospital cafeteria. Daniel shook his head. "Grandpa teaches me. He says I'm smart." "I'm sure you are," Richard agreed. He was always very intelligent himself. He taught Spanish and math and history. Daniel continued, warming to the subject. "And how to carve, of course. He says I have a natural talent for it." "May I see what else you've made?" Richard asked. Daniel hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden figure, a bird in flight, wings outstretched. The craftsmanship was remarkable for someone so young. "This is extraordinary," Richard said, genuinely impressed. "You really do have a gift." The boy's face lit up with the praise, and for a moment, Richard could see Sophia in his smile. The same warmth, the same genuineness that had so captivated Luis. "Do you think when Grandpa gets better, we could all make something together?" Daniel asked hesitantly. The question caught Richard off guard. "I'd like that very much," he answered honestly. "But your grandfather might not want me involved." Daniel frowned. "Because you fought before? Grown-ups always hold on to fights too long. That's what Grandpa says." "He's right about that," Richard admitted. By the 5th day, Luis was showing significant improvement. He was fully conscious now, able to talk, though still weak. He accepted Richard's presence without comment, focusing his limited energy on reassuring Daniel that he was getting better. "What happens when I'm discharged?" Luis asked Richard during one of the rare moments when Daniel was not in the room. His voice was neutral, carefully void of emotion. "I found it Richard considered the question carefully. "Because I saw my grandson selling toys in the rain to buy medicine for his sick grandfather. Because I realized what my pride had cost. Not just me, but you and Daniel too." He paused. "Because I'm tired of being alone." Luis closed his eyes, exhaustion evident in every line of his face. "I don't forgive you," he said at last. "I can't. I understand. But Daniel needs stability. A safe place to live. An education." Luis opened his eyes, looking directly at Richard. "So I'll accept the apartment. For his sake." The Cambridge apartment stood in stark contrast to the abandoned factory. Clean, spacious, with new furniture and large windows that filled the rooms with natural light. Daniel explored it with undisguised wonder, opening cabinets and drawers, testing every light switch. "There's food in the refrigerator," he announced, his voice echoing from the kitchen. "And the water comes out hot." Luis sat on the couch, watching his grandson's excitement with a mixture of relief and unease. He'd been discharged from the hospital that morning after 10 days of treatment. Though still weak, his breathing had improved significantly, and the doctors were optimistic about his recovery, provided he took his medication and avoided environmental triggers. Richard stood awkwardly near the door, unsure of his place in this moment. He'd arranged everything: the apartment, the stocked refrigerator, even clothes and toiletries in the proper sizes. But he felt like an intruder, watching this small family adjust to their new surroundings. "I should go," he said finally. "Let you get settled." Luis nodded, neither encouraging him to stay nor hurrying him out, a neutral acknowledgement that seemed to be their new normal. "Can I show Grandpa my room first?" Daniel asked, appearing in the hallway. "Of course," Richard replied. The boy took Luis's hand, helping him up and guiding him toward the second bedroom. Richard followed at a distance, watching as Daniel proudly showed off the space that had been prepared specifically for him. A real bed with a blue comforter, a desk with drawing supplies, shelves already stocked with books appropriate for his age. "Look, Grandpa," Daniel said, opening the closet. "I have my own tools." Inside was a child-sized workbench with wood-carving tools carefully arranged on pegboard hooks. Luis ran his fingers over them, his expression unreadable. "They're very nice," he said quietly. "Professional quality. Richard got them for me," Daniel explained. "He said you could teach me to use the harder ones when you're feeling better." Luis glanced back at Richard, who stood in the doorway. Something passed between them. Not forgiveness. Not yet, but perhaps a tentative truce. "Yes," Luis agreed. "When I'm stronger." After Richard left, he found himself returning to his penthouse with a strange sense of emptiness. The place felt cavernous and cold despite its luxurious furnishings. For the first time, he truly saw it through outside eyes, a showcase rather than a home, designed to impress rather than comfort. There were no toys scattered across the floor, no laughter echoing through the rooms, no evidence that a child had ever lived there or ever would. Over the next few weeks, Richard established a cautious routine. He would visit the Cambridge apartment every few days, noticing the textbooks spread across the table. "You were always a good student yourself." Something flickered across Luis's face, surprise, perhaps, at the acknowledgement of a shared past. "Daniel's starting public school in the fall," he said after a moment. "He tested well, but there are some gaps in his knowledge. We're working on those." "I'm going to be in 5th grade," Daniel added proudly, "even though I never went to regular school before." "That's wonderful," Richard said sincerely. "If you need any help with the enrollment process, we've handled it." Luis interrupted, not unkindly. "But thank you." Richard nodded, accepting the boundary. He'd learned to recognize when his help was welcome and when it was an intrusion. It was a delicate balance, being present without overstepping, offering support without control. Later, as Daniel showed Richard his latest wood carving, a more complex truck with movable wheels, Luis unexpectedly joined them. "His technique is improving," he observed, watching as his son demonstrated the toy's features. "He has a good teacher," Richard replied. Luis ran a hand through his gray hair, a gesture so reminiscent of his younger self that Richard felt a pang of recognition. "I've been thinking," Luis said hesitantly. "Daniel needs a proper workspace. The kitchen table isn't ideal for woodworking." Richard waited, sensing there was more to this statement. "Your house, the one in Brookline. It had that workshop in the garage. Is it still there?" The question caught Richard completely off guard. The Brookline house had been the family home, where Louis had grown up. Richard had kept it even after moving to the city, unable to sell it despite the memories it contained. Yes, he managed finally. Everything's still there. I don't use it much these days. Louis nodded, absorbing this. Maybe we could visit sometime. I could show Daniel some of the tools there, if they're still in working order. The invitation, for that's what it was, despite its careful phrasing, hung in the air between them. Richard felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. They're in perfect condition, he assured his son. I've had them maintained. Just in case you came back. The unspoken words seemed to reach Louis anyway. He gave a short nod and returned to the kitchen, leaving Richard and Daniel to their shared activity. That weekend, Richard found himself pulling into the driveway of the Brookline house for the first time in nearly a year. Louis and Daniel followed in a cab, which Richard had insisted on paying for despite Louis's objections. The house stood just as it always had, a stately colonial with mature oak trees shading the front yard. Richard unlocked the door with keys he rarely used anymore, holding his breath as he led them inside. The furniture was covered with dust cloths, giving the rooms a ghostly appearance. Richard moved through the space with growing discomfort, acutely aware of Louis taking it all in. The familiar hallways, the staircase he had run up and down as a child, the dining room where they had shared countless meals together. It's smaller than I remember, Louis said finally. Richard nodded. Things often are. Daniel explored with typical curiosity, peeking into rooms and asking questions about photographs that remained on the walls. Is that my dad? He asked, pointing to a picture of a teenaged Louis holding a trophy. Yes, Richard confirmed. Something now? He asked hopefully. Louis looked at Richard, a silent question in his eyes. Richard nodded, already moving toward the lumber stored neatly in one corner. What would you like to build? He asked Daniel. The boy considered this seriously. Something for all of us. Something that shows we're family. Louis stiffened slightly at the word, but didn't contradict his grandson. Instead, he picked up a pencil and began sketching on a scrap of paper. A jewelry box, he suggested after a moment. For the photographs and small things you want to keep safe. Daniel nodded enthusiastically, with a special compartment hidden inside. Like a secret. That sounds perfect, Richard agreed. They worked through the afternoon, falling into a rhythm that felt both new and strangely familiar. Louis guided Daniel's hands on the tools, showing him techniques Richard had once taught him. Richard measured and cut pieces according to Louis's design, respectful of his son's vision for the project. They didn't talk much beyond what was necessary for the work. There was too much still unresolved between father and son for easy conversation. But in the shared focus of creation, in the simple act of building something together, they found a language that didn't require words. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the garage windows, Daniel stepped back to admire their progress. The basic structure of the box was complete, though it would need sanding and finishing. It's getting late, Louis observed, setting down his tools. We should head back. We can continue another time, Richard suggested carefully. Maybe next weekend? Louis hesitated, then nodded. Daniel would like that. It was a small opening, barely an acknowledgement. But as they cleaned up the workspace together, Richard felt a weight lifting that he'd carried for 15 years. Outside, as they waited for the cab Richard had called, Daniel suddenly asked, "Can I put our initials on it? Like the truck?" "Of course," Louis replied. "That's tradition. All three of us," Daniel clarified. "DG for me, LG for Grandpa, and..." He looked questioningly at Richard. "RH," Richard supplied. "For Richard Harrington." Daniel nodded, satisfied. "RH, LG, and DG. That way, everyone will know we made it together." In the fading light of a summer evening, the three generations stood side by side, not quite at ease, but no longer at war. The journey ahead would be long and likely difficult. Trust, once broken, could not be instantly restored. But in that moment, watching his grandson's hands trace invisible letters in the air, Richard allowed himself to hope. The toy truck that had brought them together now sat on Daniel's bedside table in the Cambridge apartment, a bridge between past and present, a reminder of what had been lost and what might still be found. "We'll finish it next week," Louise said as the cab pulled up to the curb. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution. But it was a promise to return, to continue what they had started. And for now, that was enough.